The night they chained my ranch gate shut, they didn't just block a road, they crossed a line I warned them never to touch. You never forget the sound of silence when it turns hostile. That night, the wind was still. The moon hung above. The dry fields like a silent judge, and everything around me held its breath. I had gone to bed expecting peace. After 3 years of fighting with the HOA, I thought I had earned a small truce. But peace wasn't what they wanted. My ranch, 300 acres of sweat and memory, sat at the edge of their newly expanded private community, a title they assigned without permission and certainly without my vote. My family bought this land before most of these people were born. It had seen drought, fire, and time, but I never expected it to fall under siege by rules dressed in politeness. At first it was minor. A letter slipped into my mailbox claiming my fences were aesthetic violations. I ignored it. Then came the fines, unjustified, unsigned, but relentless. They accused me of everything from improper land usage to livestock noise violations. I fought them, of course. Sent back letters. Showed up at meetings they tried to hide from me. I told them plainly, this land is mine. You don't get to rewrite the rules just because you moved in with manicured lawns and leaf blowers. But they didn't care, because it wasn't about the violations. It was about control. The gate they sealed shut that night wasn't just metal and wood. It was my access to the cattle fields, my livelihood. It was the road my late father drove every morning to inspect the fences, the path I used to walk with, my daughter when the stars came out. Blocking it was more than a trespass, it was war. I knew something was wrong the moment I tried to open it. The chain was thick, industrial, locked tight with 2 fresh padlocks. On the front, 5 signs slapped. In a line, HOA unauthorized access prohibited, no entry, private property. That last one burned worst. My land. My blood. And they had the audacity to tell me I was the trespasser. I didn't shout. I didn't call anyone. I just stood there, under the pale glare of my truck's headlights, staring at the chain. My knuckles clenched around the gatepost until my nails dug into my palm. They had done it in the dead of night because they were cowards. They didn't want to face me. They wanted me cornered, outraged, reactive, but I wasn't going to give them that. You see, that gate wasn't just an obstacle. It was a message, the kind of message meant to break a man quietly. But I've never broken quietly. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I didn't feed the cattle. Instead, I walked the perimeter of my property, 6 miles of barbed fence, sun-dried earth, and decades of history. I checked every post. I looked for tracks, for cameras. I wasn't just angry, I was alert, because I knew this wasn't random. Someone had planned it, measured the chain, picked the night, ordered the signs. This wasn't vandalism. It was sanctioned, authorized, rubber-stamped by a board of people who smiled at me every time they passed me at the market. By noon, I got the first call. Mr. Lane, this is HOA Officer Martin. We noticed you attempted to tamper with the newly reinforced community boundary. That area is now under jurisdictional oversight. Please refer to the compliance packet delivered last week. I didn't get a compliance packet. Because they never sent one. I didn't respond. I hung up, printed out the satellite imagery of my property lines, and drove to the courthouse. I didn't speak to the front desk. I knew where to go. 2nd floor. Land registry. The same clerk from 2 years ago. Recognized me back again? He asked. They're trying to steal my land, I said flatly. He nodded like he'd heard it before, maybe he had. Within an hour, I had everything. Deed copies, boundary lines, zoning documents. Everything said the same thing. The road, the gate, the field behind it. All mine. I returned home as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dry hills. The gate was still chained, but now, behind it, stood 3 men in Navy uniforms. HOA security. They weren't police. They wanted to look like police, but they weren't. One of them raised a hand as if to stop me. I stopped my truck 10 feet from the gate, stepped out, and approached slowly. I didn't bring a weapon. I didn't need one. You're trespassing, the one in the middle said, his badge reading HOA Enforcement Division. No, I said calmly, holding out my papers. You are. He didn't take them. He didn't even look down. This is regulated land under private development, he said. You'll need board approval to access it. Board approval? I laughed once. You mean the same board that filed fraudulent boundary claims and snuck chains onto a gate they don't own? Sir, please return to your residence, he said. I didn't move. My heartbeat was steady, but something in my chest burned hot. Not rage. Resolve. Let me explain something to you, I said, stepping 1 inch closer. This land has been in my family for 73 years. We built this road, we laid that fence. I buried my father on the ridge past that tree line. And you think some bylaws printed on a laser jet can take that from me? He didn't answer. You have 24 hours, I said. Then I'm cutting that chain. I turned and left. That night I didn't sleep, not out of fear, but because I couldn't let them be the ones writing the next move. If they wanted to test how far I'd go, I had to show them they underestimated the wrong man. I sat by the window of my ranch house watching headlights come and go at the gate. They rotated shifts. They were prepared for a fight. But I didn't plan to give them the one they were expecting because the gate, that was just the beginning. I didn't wait the full 24 hours. By morning, I was at the county records office again, this time with an appointment. The girl at the desk looked nervous when I asked for zoning alterations filed by the HOA in the last 6 months. She asked if I had an attorney present. I smiled and told her, not yet. That changed her tune. The documents they gave me were like puzzle pieces, scattered and coded with legal jargon meant to confuse. But I'd been reading between the lines, long enough to see what mattered. 3 weeks ago, quietly without public notice, the HOA filed a motion to reclassify a corridor of land running directly through my ranch as a shared access preservation route. They claimed it was for community emergency logistics. I knew what that meant. They were laying the groundwork to seize the road legally. They were going to call it an easement. Wrap it in public safety language. Say it was for fire access or evacuation protocol. But I knew better. This was about pushing me off my land without ever knocking on my door. They couldn't buy me out. I'd rejected every offer they made over the last 2 years. So now they'd try to squeeze me out through bureaucracy, and the worst part, they almost succeeded. I scanned the signature line on the motion. There it was. Authorized by Victoria Hannell, HOA President. My jaw clenched. Victoria was the smiling face behind every lie. She moved in 3 years ago, right around the time things started to shift. First came the flags, then the mailbox designs, then the landscaping restrictions. She never said much to me, just polite nods and passive-aggressive smiles. But behind those smiles was a scalpel. This wasn't about compliance. It was about domination. As I drove back to the ranch, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail from HOA enforcement. They were relentless now, playing their hand faster, sensing I'd caught on. I didn't answer. I needed information, not warnings, and I knew exactly who had it. Charlie Miller was the closest thing this town had to a rebel. Former surveyor, ran his own private land rights consulting business out of a trailer by the old silo. He used to work with the county until he refused to overlook a few lines for a development project. They tried to blacklist him. Instead, he became the go-to for people like me. Charlie, I said, knocking on his battered door. I need you to look at something. He let me in without a word. Inside smelled like burnt coffee and dry paper. I laid out the files. Within minutes, his eyes narrowed. They're claiming utility rights along that road, he muttered. That's dangerous. Why? Because once a right-of-way is granted for utilities or emergency services, the land becomes subject to shared-use zoning. They'll spin it into a maintenance necessity. Before long, they'll argue they need storage sheds, staging areas, then buildings. And once a structure touches that soil, it's over. I stared at the paper. But the road's mine, every inch. They're not arguing ownership. They're arguing priority, function over title. And that's how they get people. Can I fight it? Charlie gave me a look. Legally? Maybe. But you won't win that fight in court. HOA's got ties in the zoning board. If this gets to litigation, they'll drag it out for years, drain you dry. I sat back. Years, I didn't have that kind of time or money. But, he added, if you could prove bad faith, that they filed knowingly with intent to coerce, you might just flip the board against itself. My eyes lit up. How? They're cocky. People like that always leave a trail. You just need to find it. So I did. Over the next week, I became a ghost inside their fortress. I attended meetings, quiet and watchful. I recorded everything. I found a kid on Reddit who helped me sift through metadata on HOA digital correspondence. What we found blew the doors off everything. Emails between board members discussing me, by name. He won't move. We'll force him. If we get the gate locked before the paperwork posts, he can't argue obstruction. Once we reclassify, we push for a development zone overlay. That'll scare off his cattle contracts. They weren't just pushing me out. They were planning my financial ruin. Worse yet, I found one thread labeled Strategy Session, Hanel Property Acquisition Initiative. My property, my name. A plan to convert part of my field into a nature trail to increase property values for nearby homes. They even had a mock-up design, complete with benches. That was it. The match on dry kindling. I printed everything, organized it into a folder, labeled each document. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to protest. I was going to destroy them with truth. But one thing still haunted me. My daughter, Katie, had been watching me quietly through all of this. 14 years old, brave like her mother, quiet like me. She asked one night as I sat reviewing the documents again, why don't they just leave us alone? I couldn't answer, because I didn't want to tell her the truth. That some people don't care about fairness, they care about power, and they can't stand someone who won't kneel to it. I placed a hand on hers. They think rules protect them, I said, but truth is louder than any rule. The next day, I returned to the courthouse, not to complain, but to file. Using every document I'd gathered, I submitted a complaint of fraudulent rezoning and unethical manipulation of land rights. I attached digital evidence of coercion and outlined a pattern of abuse by the HOA. But I didn't stop there. I sent anonymous packets to every homeowner in the subdivision. I uploaded the emails to a private forum titled HOA Truth Leaks. Within hours, it went viral among the community. People who had once stayed silent began asking questions. Why was the board hiding rezoning plans? Why was our money funding legal? Fees? Why was a private rancher being targeted? Victoria Hanel tried to respond. She called a special emergency board meeting, tried to reassure residents it was a miscommunication, but it was too late. The screenshots were everywhere. The designs, the emails, the mock-up trail. Her smiling face printed beside words like, force him. Neighbors began resigning from the board, 3 in one day. The final straw came when a former HOA secretary came forward with a statement. They told me to delete emails. I refused. That's when they replaced me. The county issued a temporary suspension of all rezoning activities tied to the HOA. The gate came down 2 days later, not by my hand, but by the sheriff's order. Still, I knew it wasn't over, because I hadn't made my move yet. That's what they didn't understand. This was never just about a road. It was about the storm waiting behind the silence. And now, my plan had just begun. They thought the storm had passed. After the gate came down and the emails leaked, the HOA board scrambled to reframe the narrative. Press releases, community meetings, carefully worded apologies about procedural misunderstandings. Victoria even offered to personally reach out to any affected residents, but I stayed quiet. Let them think the silence meant surrender, because silence was the one thing they didn't understand. It wasn't weakness. It was the sound of sharpening blades. By the second week, the community began to relax. People smiled again at the farmers' market. HOA enforcement trucks stopped circling my ranch. But while they lowered their guard, I was setting the final pieces of my plan in motion. It began with the land audit. Charlie helped me file for a third-party survey of boundary encroachments. Not just mine, everyone's. It was buried in the HOA state charter. Any HOA that files for community rezoning must undergo an independent compliance inspection. That meant licensed auditors crawling through every foot of land the HOA touched. I made sure to request the same firm Victoria's husband used for his development firm, one I knew had a history of creative accounting. I knew they'd find things. And they did. 2 illegal fence extensions. 1 unauthorized culvert drain rerouted through protected watershed. And most importantly, a section of decorative HOA stone wall that extended 32 feet onto a conservation easement. That was strike 1. Then came the permit trap. While posing as an interested buyer through a dummy LLC I registered, I contacted the HOA to request permits for a community improvement structure on one of the lots they were eyeing for the walking trail. I told them I was considering donating a gazebo with public seating and a small water feature. They bit immediately. Sent me pre-approval letters, site outlines, and promises of expedited processing. Without realizing I was recording every call and storing every file. Then I filed a formal permit request with the county, attaching their promises. The permit was denied because no structure was allowed on that lot under its current zoning, which meant the HOA had just knowingly misrepresented legal permissions to an investor. That was strike 2. But I wasn't after strikes. I was after leverage. Because in every war there's a moment, not when the enemy breaks, but when they realize they've already lost. And that moment came on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10:32 a.m. Victoria Hannell showed up at my ranch, unannounced. She came alone, in heels far too clean for gravel, holding a folder like a peace offering. I stepped out onto the porch and let the screen door slap behind me. The wind was sharp that day, cold enough to cut through her perfect smile. "I'd like to speak in private," she said. I didn't answer, just walked down the steps and gestured to the field. We walked past the barn through the open pasture and stood near the far fence where the trail they wanted so badly would have begun. She didn't speak at first, just looked out over the land like it offended her. "You've made quite a mess," she finally said. "No, I just swept the floor." Her lip curled. "What do you want?" There it was. Not an apology, not a truce, just the question of power. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, watching her shift uncomfortably. "I want you off the board," I said finally. "I want every member who backed this initiative to resign publicly." She laughed. "You don't have that kind of pull." I stepped closer. "No? Then I guess this recording of your vice president saying he'd falsify survey data won't matter." Her eyes narrowed. I pulled out my phone and let the audio play. His voice, clear and unmistakable. "We'll just say the path already existed. If we draw it right, no one checks." Then I showed her the email thread from their treasurer discussing how to divert HOA funds into a legal shield reserve to protect board members from personal liability. That reserve didn't exist in the public budget, and finally I handed her a copy of the whistleblower's affidavit from the former secretary, signed, notarized, and ready for public release. She paled. "You release that?" "The whole community. Burns," she whispered. "No, just you." She looked out across my ranch one last time. "You're not doing this for your land anymore, are you?" "No, I'm doing this because you thought you could bury people like me. Because you thought silence meant consent. It doesn't." She didn't speak again, just turned and walked back the way she came. 3 days later, she resigned. 5 more followed. The HOA board dissolved within the week. But I wasn't done. Because winning isn't just about removing the enemy. It's about replacing the system that gave them power in the first place. I petitioned the county for HOA restructuring. I helped organize a community vote. We formed a new board, stripped of discretionary zoning powers with every meeting live-streamed and archived. But more importantly, every resident got 1 vote. No exceptions. No silence. One morning, not long after the dust settled, I walked out to the edge of my field, right where the fake trail would have been. I stood there for a long time watching the sunrise pour gold over the hills. Katie came out and stood next to me. "Is it over?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately, because it wasn't really about the fight anymore. It was about what it proved. "That's our land," I finally said. "No one gets to take it while we're still standing." She smiled. "So, what's next?" I looked down at the battered gate, now open. The same one they tried to weld, shut. The same one I never stopped walking through. "Now," I said, "we rebuild. But this time, no one's watching from the porch." It didn't happen all at once. The neighborhood didn't suddenly become perfect. The sun didn't rise differently. And peace wasn't some grand ceremony where everyone clapped and forgave. But it was quieter. And that quiet wasn't fear anymore. It was peace earned. The first real sign of change came from my neighbors. People who used to look the other way when I spoke up. Some of them had signed the petition to block me out. Some had just stayed silent. But after the board collapsed, they began to show up differently. Carl Henderson, who once told me, "You knew the rules when you moved in," drove up one morning with a box of post hole diggers and offered to help me rebuild my fencing. No speech, no apology. Just dirt on his hands and sweat on his brow. It was enough. Then there was Maya, a retired teacher from 2 lots over, who started organizing monthly open forum meetings in the town hall. No closed doors, no HOA filters, just people talking about what mattered: roads, schools, water access, safety. And when the new board was formed, every member was elected by a vote. Every record went public. And every resident had the right to veto any new zoning or regulation that affected private land. Some of the older board members tried to stir things up, hinted at lawsuits, wrote editorials warning of anarchy. But the community didn't. Listen, they'd seen the truth now. Once people know what real power looks like, they don't surrender it again so easily. I was asked to serve on the new board. I declined. My fight wasn't about sitting in another chair. It was about breaking the chains they thought we'd never question. Still, I stayed involved. Quietly. I attended meetings. I advised the land committee. I helped other ranchers document their water rights and utility easements, some of which the HOA had tried to suppress for years. We discovered 2 entire properties had been misclassified, overcharged in fees for nearly a decade. We fixed it. It took time, but it happened. One evening, months later, Katie and I stood at the edge of the trail, the real trail, the one the community approved, designed, and built together. It curved gently along the tree line, avoiding all private land, weaving through wildflower meadows and shaded creeks. Children ran across the footbridge laughing. An old couple sat on a bench nearby, watching the birds. Katie squeezed my hand. "Remember when they said this was impossible?" I nodded. "Remember when they welded the gate shut?" I smiled. She grinned back. "They thought that would break you." "They didn't understand," I said. "I don't break. I build." The trail wasn't just a path through the woods, it was a scar that healed right. And our ranch, it flourished, not because the land changed, but because I could breathe again. I planted wild grass across the eastern field that summer, brought in a pair of Highland calves, then a few laying hens, fixed the old barn roof with leftover timber from the town's community garden project. It wasn't a revolution. It was something quieter, something stronger, a return. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just one line typed on plain white paper. "We never thought you'd fight back. You reminded us that we should have." I didn't need to know who sent it. I already knew, because that's what happens when you stand up. You give others permission to do the same. I got calls from 2 towns over. Ranchers, homeowners, single moms, veterans, people who'd been pushed around by their own HOAs. People who'd been told they didn't belong, that they didn't matter, that their land wasn't truly theirs. I shared everything I'd learned. Every document, every strategy, every loophole. I watched them begin their own battles. Some lost, some won, but none stayed silent. And that was the legacy. It wasn't the gate, or the resignation letters, or the fact that the board president now lived in another county, far from the trail she tried to steal. It was the voice people found. That was the real victory. One evening, as the sky turned the color of burnt honey and the cicadas began their long whistle, Katie sat with me on the porch. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't fought?" she asked. I didn't have to. I knew exactly what would have happened. They would have paved over the pasture, fenced off the trail, turned the land into a regulated corridor, one step at a time. They would have sent fine after fine until I either caved or left, and then they'd do it again to someone else. Because that's how systems like that work, until someone says no more. "I think about it every day," I said. She leaned, her head on my shoulder, "But now," I whispered, "I think about what happens next. Because that's the thing about reclaiming your land. It's not just about the soil. It's about reclaiming your story, your voice, your right to live without permission." And as the stars blinked into view above the ranch I almost lost, I realized something. They never stood a chance. Not really. Because they came with rules. I came with roots.